Well, good morning. This is Craig Stocks here for Utah Desert Remote Observatories. Last night I imaged M82, so this morning I thought I would walk through the entire process, even a quick review of the capture, and then all the way from PixInsight through Photoshop and ending up in Lightroom. I've just briefly glanced at the data to ensure I got something, but that's all I've done. So we'll go through everything together, and I hope you find this useful. So the first thing I want to do is go over the capture sequence. After that, then we'll quickly look through the data that I captured last night with the PixInsight blink tool, because it's important to call out any of the less than great frames. Fewer good frames is better than more bad frames. So let's just take a quick look at the remote computer. So the screen that you see here, this is the remote computer that I have up at the remote observatory. We host telescopes for customers all over the world. This happens to be mine, so I have a little Nook computer that's attached to that telescope, and I connect to that using Google Remote Desktop. And then I'm using Voyager. I've got the Voyager window open here to control the sequence during the night. And we can just real quickly open the sequence that I used last night for M82, and it should be right here. And there's a whole series of different settings that you can set and then save this sequence configuration. And maybe I can make this a little bit larger. That should be a little bit better. So the target is M82. And all the RA, declination, and rotation angle were all loaded from using a tool that's with Voyager to kind of create that view. I've got 4 or 5 filters, I guess, selected here. I've got hydrogen, then red, green, blue, and luminance. Hydrogen, I'm going to shoot 600-second exposures, and I want to do 3 of those, and then 5 each of red, green, and blue at 300 seconds, and then luminance at 300 seconds. So 10 minutes, and then these are all 5 minutes. I'm shooting 5 of the red, green, blue, and luminance, so I'll wind up with a little bit more of those. And then I'm also repeating this 6 times. M82 is basically going to be available all night, although it does get lower as it goes around the North Celestial Pole. So not all of them may turn out great. We did have some high clouds move in last night, so I don't know how much effect that's going to have. But overall, it's going to repeat this 6 times or until I have the sequence stop in the way I have the night programmed. So that was the setup to get things going. And the next thing I did then was create a drag script, or actually I just put this sequence in my drag script. And if I look at the drag script that I normally use, and this is a simple tool that comes with Voyager, and most of this is just pretty standard stuff that you create your first script from a template and then you just change the details. So it basically goes through the startup sequence, waits for astronomical dark, and then the first place of real interest is right here in this block that says sequence 1. And within sequence 1 you can see that we have this sequence, and if I just left click on this, or actually if I right click and then choose configuration, it'll bring up the dialog. This is where I've told it to use the sequence file M82 and start immediately, which is going to be at astronomical dark, or actually even about a half hour before astronomical dark. I cheat a little bit on both the beginning and end of the night. And it's going to run until 3:30 a.m. And then at 3:30 a.m. it'll finish whatever sub-exposure it's in the middle of, and then it will go on to sequence 2, which in this case, sequence 2, is set to go to the Trifid Nebula from about 3:30 in the morning until astronomical dawn. So that is how I control which sequence runs, and I can just edit this drag script each night and put whatever sequences I want in the sequence for the night. So let's move ahead to, I'll disconnect from the computer and we'll close this window. And we don't need this anymore because we're going to create a brand new one. So the first thing I want to do, now we're in PixInsight and we're back on my home computer. And during the night, as Voyager was capturing data, it was sharing it to a Dropbox folder that's shared between my remote computer and my home computer. And then I just copy it from that Dropbox folder, which I treat as temporary, into a more permanent resting place on my D drive. So the first thing we want to do is go to Processes, Image Inspection, Blank, and we'll open the data from last night. And there's my M82 folder, and it's in a folder with last night's date. I'll just select all and click Open, and Blank will go through and open a preview for each one of these files from last night, so we can step through and toss out any of the ones that are less than average or less than ideal. You can be as critical or easy on it as you feel is appropriate, depending on how good the data is overall. Sometimes I'll keep some less than perfect data just so I have something to work with. Now, one of the things it does by default is it will calculate the screen stretch for the first file, and then it just applies that to all files. And if we just had broadband red, green, and blue, that might be okay. But since we've got HA and luminance mixed in here, they're going to need their own stretch. So if I click on this top icon, that will calculate and apply a unique screen stretch or screen transfer function to each one of the files, so we can view them all kind of on an even basis. And it just takes a few seconds, but it will give us a more usable preview of every file. And we can see this first file. I'm looking at two things. I'm looking at the size of the stars, and are they a little fuzzy like they are here? And secondly, was there any tracking error, camera motion, wind, something that affected the sub? So this one looks a little bit fuzzy, and actually if we go to the next one, we can see that it is quite a bit sharper. So right off the bat, I'm going to throw out this first sub. And the way I throw them out is the icon here, was that fifth from the left, move the selected files to a new location. So I'll select that, and then I'm going to navigate to a folder on my D drive called Rejects. And we'll select this folder. So what that did was move this file from my M82 folder into my Rejects folder. I didn't delete it, I've just moved it into a Rejects folder, and then I'll temporarily leave it there, and periodically I'll go back and clear that folder out. And now we can just step through. Let's see, that one's debatable. I think I'll go ahead and pull this one out too. And since we've already selected the Rejects folder, we can just select folder. And then we just quickly step through. Once you have one selected, you can use the cursor key to step through. Whoop, now we're into the green. This one, either the wind caught the telescope, something happened with this one, so that's an obvious reject. Go to the next ones. Those all look reasonable, not great, but. And I may pull some of these out. The weighted batch preprocessor will do some culling. Hydrogen, here's another one. This was a 10-minute frame. You can see again some motion in that, so we'll pull that one out. That looks good. That one's got some, I think we had some wind last night. appears to have some motion, so we'll throw it out. And then our luminance. These generally look pretty good. Some better than others. But you'll find this is a very important step. It's a little bit tedious to go through, but it is important. I can also see that next time I'm up at the observatory, I need to clean the sensor on the camera and then do a new set of flats. I'm fortunate my systems are pretty symmetrical, so I use flats for a long time before I retake them. So at this point we're done with blink, and we've gone through and threw out any of the lesser frames. So now I'll go straight to script, batch processing, weighted batch preprocessor. And by default, this is saved with the settings from the last time I used it. And a lot of times I can reuse those same settings or a lot of those settings, but this time I'm just going to start with a reset. I will save the settings, but I'm going to clear all files just so we can see how this works. So along the top are the various tabs, for instance, lights, flats, darks, and this is where your files that you've loaded show up. You load the files with the buttons at the bottom. So I'll start by loading my light frames, and we'll just go back to the M82. We've already pulled out the bad ones and moved them to the rejects folder, so I can just select all, click OK, and there's all of my files from last night: red, green, blue, luminance, and hydrogen. Flats, darks, and bias, what I do is use the directory feature. So I'll load a whole directory at once, and I've got a directory for calibration frames, and within that I have one that's called mono combined, and this is just the darks, flats, and biases that I most often use with the monochrome camera that I currently have on the PlaneWave. So when I select this folder, that will load. If we now look, there's my bias frames, there's my dark frames, and it loaded 5-minute, 10-minute, 5-minute, and 2-minute. This time we don't have any 2-minute, so I can just remove that group. Flats, it's loaded basically all of the flats, but in this case I don't have any oxygen or sulfur, so I'll just remove those. And now I've got all of my files loaded. I'll go to the calibration frame and just do a couple things here. First, I'll set a pedestal value of usually at least 300. And that keeps me from getting kind of image artifacts. Sometimes I have to crank that up to something like 600, and then I'll just apply that to all light frames. These are not color filter array images, so I don't need to do anything with the CFA settings. I will change this to automatic since this is my first night with this data. If I collect additional data, then I would use manual, and I would look in the log file and pick the same reference file that was used the night before. And then last, I need to set up a swap directory, and to do that I'll just go to my swap folder, create a new folder, and we'll just name this M82. Not a very imaginative name. Select that folder. So at this point it should be ready to run. If we look at the post calibration, we can see we've got 3 hours and 45 minutes, so not a lot of data. I can use diagnostics, but if you click run, it will do diagnostics first anyway. Everything looks okay. We're going to use 26, almost 27 gigabytes of data. We have 62 available. I need to go through and clean up some of my working space and open that up a little bit. But at this point I'll just hit continue, and now the execution monitor opens up. We can see it running, and I'm going to pause at this point and go get some breakfast and let this run, and we'll come back when it's finished and continue on. Okay, I am back, and as you can see from the execution monitor, the WBPP has finished running. with success on everything. It took it 16 minutes and 45 seconds. And during that time, I was able to get a bowl of cereal, and I've got a cup of coffee, actually a cup of espresso, to power through. So let's see what we got out of this. At the beginning, we were looking at an image of M82 from last year. So I don't know if, I doubt if this is going to be as dramatic as that one, because that one did have more data. This has about 3 hours and 45 minutes. So we'll open the files, and our goal here with PixInsight is really just to create 5 files, actually 3 files that we'll take into Photoshop. The RGB composite version of both the nebula, and then separately one of the stars, and then the luminance without stars, and the HA also without stars. The stars will only be in there one time, and that's from the RGB data, and we'll probably actually process it twice, once for the colors in the galaxy and once for the stars. So let's open first the RGB. So I'll go to the M82 folder and master, and we'll just sort this in date modified sequence. So here's my blue, green, and red. We'll just start with these. Oh, apparently I opened the flats instead of the master lights. Let's try this again. Here we have our red, green, and blue master lights. That looks better. So typically I just start by doing a channel combination. I haven't even looked at these stretched and don't know that there's really any reason to. I'll just grab the 3 files here and drop them into the RGB sequence. So we have red, green, and blue to combine. Click on the circle. There's our RGB image. So we're done with channel combination, and in fact we're done with these 3. And let's see what this looks like. It'll typically have a color cast of some sort. Yep, it's pretty blue. So first thing I'm going to do is run a dynamic background extraction using a subtract correction method. And I just have that saved with samples scattered around the perimeter. And this will neutralize the background and also resolve any gradient that we might have from the moon. And let's update our screen preview and see what this looks like. Looks better. And yeah, you can definitely see my my camera needs cleaned, but that's okay. So the next thing I want to do is do a color correction for the stars, and for that I'm going to use the spectrophotometric color calibration. And again, I have a process icon saved with settings for the monochrome camera with my astronomic red, green, and blue filters. So we'll run that, and that will give us the natural colors, or the correct colors, if you will, for the stars, and more or less for the galaxy as well. And this is about done. This is what the graph looks like. Not the best I've ever seen, but it's better than it was. So next I will run Blur Exterminator, and I usually just kind of look at the stars and judge how much do they need sharpened and reduced. And these I think I'm gonna turn it up just a little bit from its default of 25 to about 30. That'll be a little bit more aggressive on the stars. So we'll run that, and this normally takes about 30 seconds to run on my computer. If you have an NVIDIA graphics card or graphics processor, it makes a world of difference running these AI plugins like Blur Exterminator and Noise Exterminator and Star Exterminator. I can remember, early on using the StarNet++, and it would take an hour for each file to run on my older computer. Now it runs in 30 seconds by being able to use the graphics acceleration in PixInsight. So I just night and day difference, and that productivity really translates into better images. And I am convinced of that. So things that can make the process faster really pay off. So there's the deconvoluted version. So now I want to stretch this, and I think I actually want to do two stretches. I want to do one concentrating on the galaxy and one concentrating on the stars. So I'm going to just make a quick duplicate of this, and I'll grab the screen transfer function and histogram transformation. And we want to do this with the channels linked. And I can zoom in a little bit to see the sliders better. It's a little touchy with my mouse wheel. We'll do the stars first. And so for the stars, we primarily want to darken everything to make the stars a little bit smaller and crisper. And let's say something like that. Pull this down to histogram transformation, execute it, and then turn off the screen stretch. So the last thing I would do with this one is run Noise Exterminator. And I'm really going to be focusing just on the stars from this one. So once I extract the stars, we'll save those, and then we'll be done with the darker version. And Noise Exterminator is about done. So Noise Exterminator has run. And last we're going to use Star Exterminator. There is a bug that you frequently need to go back and reselect the AI version each time you restart PixInsight. But I want to generate a star image and use the unscreen method. So we'll run that. And like I say, this will take about 30 seconds to run. And then that will give us a nice, clean, sharpened, reduced size star image that we can use for the stars. One last thing I may do with that is boost the saturation. I find especially when you're putting the stars back over a bright, like an SHO version of the nebula, the color really tends to get lost when you put it over a colorful nebula. So frequently I'll need to boost the saturation, and while it's still in this somewhat raw 32-bit version, is usually a good time to do that. So there's our star image, and I think I will boost the saturation a little bit. So I'll just go to, close this, I'll go to curves, choose a real-time preview, go to saturation, and just pull the curve up. That looks good, so we'll apply that. Close curves, close the preview. Now we're ready to save our stars. So I'll just go to File, Save As, and I'm going to go back to that same folder where I had my data. And I'm going to save this as a TIFF, and I'll just keep the name. Oh. Somehow it changed the name, so I was clicking around too much. So let me go back to Save As, M82. This is the name I want. So we'll save that, and because this is already stretched, we can save this as a 16-bit TIFF, and that will give us plenty of data to work with. Typically I'll wind up doing some modifications in Photoshop, but 16-bit is a good starting point. So I'll just park this out of the way. There's our starless image, but we don't really need this, so I'm just going to close this. Now we'll stretch this version with more emphasis on preserving the look of the galaxy. And I do want to darken the background a little bit, and perhaps even this time lighten up the galaxy. Eventually a lot of it is going to come from the luminance and the HA data, but let's get the best starting point that we can. Just just kind of fine-tuning the sliders. Once I get it so that it looks good, copy it down, apply it, turn off the screen stretch, and now I want to run Noise Exterminator and Star Exterminator, and for that I'm going to use a process container. A process container contains multiple processes, just like an image container would contain or represent multiple images. And so I have Noise Exterminator and Star Exterminator combined in one process container. That way I can just run them both kind of in one fell swoop by dragging it onto the image, and that gives me more time to go check email or take a sip of coffee or whatever suits my fancy as it's running. So the Noise Exterminator is done. Star Exterminator is about done. I'm watching the monitor on my other monitor. There we go. So still see some of the dust spots. That's okay. We can clean those up easily in Photoshop. But we'll save this. And again, we're going to save this in our M82 folder as a 16-bit TIFF. So select 16-bit. Okay. And we'll minimize this and park it down here with the stars, just in case we want to do anything future with them. Let's look at the other two files. So double click and let's open the luminance and the hydrogen. And we'll just work on these in whatever order they come in. Looks like hydrogen's first. Let's see what we've got here. That looks pretty good. Since all we're really after is something here in the core, I'm not even going to bother with dynamic background extraction. I'm just going to go straight to Blur Exterminator and just run that at the defaults. And again, we don't really care about the stars here because we're going to clean this up, remove the noise, remove the stars, and have just the RA, or just the HA represented. So Blur Exterminator is about done. I tell you, hats off to Russell Croman for creating these three Exterminator plugins. Are just fantastic. So, I mean, that for just one night's data, a total of 3 hours, that looks like a pretty good starting point. Let's stretch this. So, just zooming in to get a little bit of room to move the sliders, and kind of almost always darken the darks, and then it looks like I can perhaps lighten the lights just a little bit. I don't want to. I'm kind of watching the detail here in the core. I'm trying to. It's a little hard to judge, but I don't want to blow that out. I can always stretch it more. So I want to be a little bit cautious here. I think I'll quit there. Yeah, I say we will fine-tune this once we get into Photoshop. So that's applied, and now I'll just run Noise Exterminator and Star Exterminator on this file. Notice that I didn't do any cropping. Most tutorials I see in PixInsight start with a dynamic crop. I don't do that for a couple of reasons. I like to preserve everything as it is so that I can add data from subsequent nights. So for instance, if I image M82 again tonight or tomorrow night or next month, I will most of the time go back to the same reference frame that was used for this integration, and that lets me, for instance, I don't have to redo the stars because the stars data is probably sufficient. So all I would really need to shoot is perhaps more HA and more luminance. So that looks pretty good. So we'll just go File, Save As, navigate to the M82 folder, change the file type to TIFF, and we'll save this as a 16-bit TIFF. We'll minimize this, and we're ready for the last, which is the luminance. A lot of dust spots. I really need to clean that up. So again, I'm just going to run Blur Exterminator. Most of these spots are going to be real easy to clean up, by the way, depending on how I treat the background. And we'll know here in just a minute when we start our stretch. There's a lot of IFN surrounding this, and I was shooting this basically right after a full moon, so we may or may not have a lot of IFN visible. It looks like we may have some. So I may want to preserve some of that IFN nebulosity, in which case I'll have to be a little more careful with how I clean up the dust motes. So let's look at our stretch here. Yeah, it looks like I think I will, at least for now, preserve some of the luminosity from the IFN. So we just want to make sure we have a good representative view with nothing blown out except maybe stars. Yeah, a lot of detail in there. And there is some gradient here, isn't there? I wonder what would happen if we do a dynamic background extraction. This may or may not be an improvement. And if we don't like it, we can always just undo it. That definitely cleaned up the gradient. Let's reset this. There we go. That I think is better. And we can still see some of that luminosity from the IFN that we're looking through to see this galaxy. Lots of good detail there. I think I like this better, so I'm going to stick with the IFN in the background. And again, we can always kill it once we get into Photoshop if we decide it doesn't add to it. It's one of the struggles with an image with a lot of IFN, or kind of a situation where you've got two different potential subjects. One subject could be the IFN, one could be the galaxy. And if you make them both very prominent, then they can wind up competing for attention in the image, or at least that's the way I tend to look at it. So I tend to try to choose one or the other to really be kind of the star or the focus of the image, either the IFN or the galaxy. So if I really bring out the IFN, then I would generally subdue the galaxy a little bit so that they're not competing. But that's an artistic decision you need to make as you work on your images. So this is our luminance data. Yeah, it looks pretty bad with all those dust motes, but we'll clean those up. So File, Save As. Again, we'll go to the M82 folder, and we're going to save this as a TIFF, 16-bit. So at this point, we have all of our images. We have the luminance. We have our HA data, both of those starless. We have our RGB color image that we'll use for the color. And then lastly, we have the stars that we'll put on top of everything. So let's go to Photoshop and put these together. And I've had people ask about galaxies and adding HA to galaxies, and I've also had people ask about LRGB data and how you combine those. So this is a good opportunity to cover both of those topics. So if you've watched my videos before, you know we start with File, Scripts, Load Files into Stack, and this is a standard script that comes with Photoshop. And we'll just browse to find the files we want to load. And we'll go to the D drive, to my Astro folder, Nook 1, M82, and there are the 4 TIFF files. We'll just select all 4 of those. If we had more files, we could go browse and add more files if we needed to. Otherwise, just click OK. And Photoshop is going to load each one of those files as a layer And we'll see them appear over here on the right side in the layer stack. And so we've got just a little bit of housekeeping to do first. We want to put each one of these layers into a group and name the group. So it looks like luminance wound up on top, so I'll just do Control G, double click the name it luminance. And I know I'm going to be adding levels adjustment, so I'll just go ahead and add that. And we'll just close this and turn that group off for now. Looks like HA is next, so Control G. Double click on the name. This is hydrogen. Add a levels adjustment. And the beauty of doing this in groups is these levels adjustments will work on just the group that it's in. Turn that off. Looks like our RGB color is next. So we'll just name this RGB. Turn that off, and then the stars came in last. Control G. Name this stars. And this time I'm going to add both the levels and a hue saturation because I almost always use those. And we will probably wind up running a sharpen on the stars, so we can go ahead and do that now since we know we're going to. Just click on the layer with the stars, right click, choose Convert to Smart Object, right there. And now we can non-destructively run the Smart Sharpen. Stars don't usually need real aggressive sharpening, so maybe something like that. Click OK. And the reason this is non-destructive, twofold. One, you'll see that the Smart Filter will show up underneath the Smart Object layer. I can just double click on Smart Sharpen and reopen that filter and change the settings. The other thing I can do, I can double click on the layer itself, and it will open that layer as it was before we converted it into a Smart Object. So for instance, if I find a dust mote that I didn't clean up that I need to go back and fix, I can double click on this layer and go back to the original layer, edit it, and then save it, and it puts it back into the Smart Object. So we can close this group. The last thing we'll do with this group is put it in screen blending mode, and we'll just drag it up to the top of stack, which is where it's going to live, and I'll turn it off. And now we start cleaning up the things that need cleaned up, and that's going to be mostly the luminance layer. So first thing I need to do is clean up. We've got a lot of residual from the little background galaxy there. A lot of residual from star removal. Some of these I think are galaxies, some of these are just dross from the star removal. So the first thing I want to do is clean those up. I'm going to, and I'm actually going to do this destructively, and the reason I'm doing it destructively is I find I rarely want to put defects back into an image. But we've got some areas where bright stars were removed, plus some of these dust motes. So I'm going to grab the spot healing brush. I'm sorry, it's the healing brush. And it works kind of like the clone stamp in that you have a brush and you can pick a source point by alt-clicking, and then as you draw paint over the offending area, it will use the source to blend in, but it really does a great job of blending in, so that it's, where the clone stamp can be pretty harsh, this tool does a real nice job of blending, and since this is all just pretty uniform stuff, we just have the gradual gradients from the IFN. I can be a little bit more aggressive and just use the healing brush. In some ways, it doesn't matter a lot what you use as the clone source or the healing source. because it always blends it in with whatever is around it. So that's a real nice plus to using the healing brush. It really does a good job of blending things together. And some of this, it's hard to tell for sure what's structure and what's dust mote. Some of it's pretty obvious. So we'll just go around and clean these up. We've got a few areas, like up here, where there is some detail that we want to not trounce over. So I'm going to be a little bit more careful there. Generally, as you zoom in, the more you zoom in, the more you'll see that is a problem, and just kind of quickly trying to pick out the things that are residuals. I know this isn't a very exciting video to watch, but it's part of the process, and I find I think if I try to make the video go quickly, I wind up kind of missing some of these fine details, and sometimes it's the details that matter. So that's one of the reasons I'm really taking the time making probably a much too long video out of this. But if you watch the whole thing, you'll see things that you wouldn't have seen otherwise. And you'll find too, the more data you have, the better star removal works. And when you have just a little bit of data like this is a little under 4 hours, it's going to have a lot of these spots that didn't get removed. So now we've got these two areas to deal with. This one I could probably use the healing brush, but we are really starting to get into detail, and here we're definitely in detail. So I'm going to use a completely different method for this. I'm going to add a blank layer right above the layer that has the pixels on it, and I'm going to put that in soft light blending mode. And my previous video spent quite a bit of time talking about different layers and blending modes, but what soft light does is let you do what historically would be called burning and dodging. And what I'll do is just go to the brush tool, which you can get to by tapping B on the keyboard, and I'll choose a brush size that's about the size of the thing I want to repair. And if I paint with white, we're at 100% opacity right now. If I paint with white on this soft light layer, that will lighten what's below, but it doesn't remove it. It just makes it brighter, but as you can see, the detail that was there is still there. Conversely, if I paint with black, I can tap X to just switch between black and white. It does the same thing. It darkens, but it doesn't overwrite. It just darkens. So what I want to do is paint with a lower opacity brush, and I'll go to something like 10% by tapping the 1 key, and switch to white as my foreground color, and just gradually work on this area that had a dust mote where it's too dark. And the reason I'm doing this is I'm not changing any of the underlying detail. I'm only changing the brightness of it. Now I say this one you could probably get away with using the healing brush. So this might be excessively cautious, and sometimes you need to go back and forth a little bit, and then eventually as you start to get close to being done, I'll need to reduce the brush opacity. So let's go to, if I do 0.5 quickly, that chooses 5%. And now I can get into some of these finer areas. And you'll occasionally see me switch back and forth between white and black as you and iteratively lighten and darken areas to smooth this area out and completely hide that dust mote. Some are more tedious than others. Looks like we've got some star residue in here also, which makes it a little bit more difficult. Sometimes you paint an area and realize that you're painting with the wrong color. But the idea is to go slowly. If you work with a pen and a graphics tablet, like a Wacom graphics tablet, that can make this go faster and easier. I'm just using the brush at this point. Not great. And I think what I'm going to do is just undo this. Since this one is, I'm going to grab the healing brush and at least get part of this with the healing brush. Now I'll go back up here, go back to the brush, and this one definitely needs to be done the hard way. And generally the larger brush you can use, the better it's going to do. And be sure to zoom in and out and make sure you're not doing something that you didn't intend to do. And sometimes you have to make a little bit of a judgment call as far as what's a dust mode and what's real data. But for where we're at, that looks pretty good. I don't need a selection. And I'm probably going to next go to the levels. And I'm pretty sure I want to darken the background. And we may even want to darken the nebula a little bit. Let's see. Yeah, I think the center of that I probably want to darken. So what I'm going to do is add a second levels adjustment and focus on just the core of the galaxy there where we have all this great detail. And I'm going to invert the mask by selecting the mask, and then Control-I will invert that. So now we've hidden that levels adjustment that we just made. Now, since I've selected the mask, I'll paint with white, and I can use like a 30% opacity, and paint that adjustment into the core to keep it from being too bright. So that maintains some of that dynamic range. So for now, I'm going to say that's our luminosity. It looks like there's a few areas where we might want to use our burning and dodging to even out some of the star residual. This is just another way of repairing some of that star removal residual. So let's call that our luminance. So I'll close that group, turn it off. Hydrogen should be pretty easy because we really only care about the center. So I'm going to do two things here. I'm going to convert this to a smart object. And then I'm going to sharpen this layer. I probably should have sharpened our luminance layer also. But generally, targets like this, these can usually take quite a bit of sharpening. That's too much. So it's a dance between the radius and the amount. Find something that sharpens but still looks natural and maybe still has some room. I'll click OK. The core here looks pretty good in terms of its brightness, but I think I want to try to bring out more of the jets. So let's see what happens with our levels. yeah, we can definitely bring out more of the peripheral. There's just not enough data here for a lot of it. So maybe something like that. And we may want to mask a little bit here in the center. That looks like that's maybe getting a little too bright. So I'm painting on this levels mask with black to hide some of that effect. And for the most part, the rest of this we just don't really care about. So even though there's star residuals and this is too dark and it's noisy, we're really only going to be using this central part. So you'll see that doesn't really matter. So we'll close this, and let's just go back and sharpen our luminance while we're thinking about it. So again, I'll convert this to a smart object. And filter, sharpen, smart sharpen. And I don't think this is going to take a lot of sharpening. It would be easy to go too far with this because there is a lot of fine detail here. Of course, the nice thing is you can adjust your settings for each layer so that each layer gets the amount and kind of sharpening that works best for it based on the kind of detail in that particular layer. So smart objects are a great way to do non-destructive editing. So last we have our RGB data. Again, this has a lot of dust motes, but all we really want from this is the color. So I'm just going to grab our healing brush and just be pretty cavalier about things I'm going to take out here, because ultimately, for the most part, they don't matter. So in fact, in our levels, I'll take the background even a little bit darker. Luminosity doesn't matter a lot because that's going to come from the luminosity layer. I am going to add a hue saturation, and since this is our color layer, let's add color. So one of the fun things you can do at this point is, if I turn the stars back on, we'll see a somewhat complete image with stars and with our color data. I think I'll add luminance next, so I'm just going to move it down in the order. Let's turn on our luminance layer, and right now it's just overlaying our RGB data. But what we really want to do is use the luminance from luminance and color from below. So I'm going to actually I can just go to the where it says pass through here, and notice I have the group selected. I'm going to change this group's blending mode to luminosity. So now we're getting the luminosity from this layer and color from below. And you can see there's a lot of kind of ugly color, so we need to knock this background down to just pure black. And the trick I'm going to use for that is I'm going to add a solid color fill, and we'll make it something like 20, 20, 20 in the RGB colors. We just need it to be on the dark side. The exact number isn't that important. Then I'm going to put it in lighten blending mode. And what that will do is, you'll notice that the background now has become just almost pure. If I turn this off, that was what was before, and you noticed in general there's some blue cast and still some artifacts back here from star removal, but they're all darker than this 20, 20, 20, or I think it actually went up at 19. When I turn this on, it lightens everything that is darker than it. And if we need to fine tune it, I can double click on the layer icon and it reopens that dialog box, or we can, if we need to fine tune this any, we can. We can also come back to our levels, and if we need to adjust anything here to bring out more of the, we're getting more of the galaxy, but we're also getting some just a matter of finding the right balance. And we still have some areas showing through, so I'm going to do one last thing. I'm just going to add a blank layer here and paint with black. Let me grab the brush tool, and we'll just paint with black here. Any place where we see some of that blue poking through, and that will ensure that there's no unwanted color. Now when we turn our luminance back on, it's much cleaner. We don't have the artifacts from around the galaxy showing through. So that gives us a nice LRGB. And again, because it's non-destructive, we can always come back here and adjust as we go to make it better. Turn stars on to get a preview. The last thing we want to do is add the hydrogen. So let's turn the hydrogen layer on. And hydrogen, we really just want to bring out the red from the hydrogen. So what we're going to do, two things. We're going to put this in lighten blending mode and use just the red. And to do that, I'm going to double click here to the right of the layer name, and I'm going to turn off the green and blue components of this so that we're only using red. So now this layer is contributing only red, but it's contributing red everywhere. And because it's in normal blending mode, if it's darker, it's darkening it, which is cyan. And we really only want to lighten. So I'm going to change this from pass through to lighten blending mode. And you can experiment sometimes. Sometimes lighten works well, sometimes screen works better. And it looks like in this case screen, which is a little bit more aggressive, works even better. But again, it's having effects beyond what we want. So we'll add a layer mask to the group this time, and I'm just going to invert the whole group with Control I. That inverted the mask. Now I'll come back with a white brush and just paint with white to bring back those areas that we want to be able to see. And now we can go back to our levels. And because I'm changing the levels for the hydrogen detail, I'm only affecting the hydrogen. And you can bring that out as much or as little as you want. And I've got a little bit of blue coming through from our color layer, so I'm going to come in here and darken this down so that it's not contributing. And last thing, of course, is going to be to turn the stars back on and see how it looks with it all together. Not too bad. I might bring up the background just a little bit if we want to show some of that IFN. So for 3.5 hours of data under an almost full moon, that's not too bad. Any one of these layers, if we want more or less color in the galaxy, we can come back to the RGB layer to adjust that. On the HA, we might be able to bring out just a touch more HA with a burning and dodging layer, where we can selectively brighten some of these areas. So if I paint with white, that's just selectively lightening some of those areas. So lots of fun can be had at this point. So I think at this point, I'm going to erase some of my burning and dodging here and try this again. Get a little more careful in my approach. So at this point, I would save this as a finished document. Looks like I might want to darken the... Not sure if I want to darken that or not. Maybe just a little bit. So this becomes very iterative, and I apologize. This is not very interesting to watch. But like I said, I didn't want to shortchange you on some of the finer details. So at this point, I'm going to save this document. So File, Save As, and this is going to be a huge document, so I'll save it as a large document format, or .psb, and I'm going to put that in my 2023 pictures folder. So that's under my documents, photos, 2023 photos, and we'll just call this M82 4 hours data, LRGB plus HA, and save that. The last thing I do, if you recall, we haven't cropped. There's a lot of things we haven't done with this image yet. So the last thing I'm going to do is open up Lightroom. And this, my catalog is getting awfully large, so it sometimes takes a while to get loaded and ready to go. But Lightroom has some wonderful tools for fine-tuning a photo. It also has great tools for creating smaller copies of an image. Its export functionality. So I'll really do three things primarily in Lightroom. Four if you count organizing the data, because I keep all of my images in my Lightroom catalog. But I'll do my final crop in Lightroom. I'll do final color correction, sharpening, detail, add, using clarity and texture sliders to bring out even more of that detail, an overall final sharpening, possibly some noise reduction, and then I will create exported versions of that to, for instance, post onto Facebook, or to that I'll use to create the thumbnail that I'm ultimately going to use for this video. So you will actually have seen the finished part of this as the thumbnail to the video, and I haven't even created it yet. So that's kind of interesting. So as soon as this finishes loading, I can stop rambling, and we'll scroll down in the folders view to 2023. Oh, there it just went by. So there's my 2023 folder, and we just saved that image in the 2023 folder. So the last thing I need to do here is, as soon as it's done loading, and keep in mind I've still got PixInsight in the background, Photoshop is open with a large document. I'm recording this as I'm speaking, so the computer's got a lot going on. So it will get there easily. Getting closer. So I can right click on 2023, choose Synchronize Folder, and there's probably just that one new image. Click Synchronize, and what it's going to do is going to go through the 2023 folder and automatically import any new files that it finds. And there it is. That if for some reason you're saving Photoshop documents in large document format, if Lightroom can't read them, there's a setting for preserve compatibility in PSB files in Photoshop that you need to check. So let's go to the Develop module, and our black level looks pretty good. Histogram in general looks okay. But the tools in Lightroom for playing with the different tones are really great. We can lighten or darken the background. We can play with the saturation up or down if we want. Texture and clarity can sometimes just work wonders on a galaxy or a nebula. It can be pretty nasty on stars, so you do need to be a little bit cautious with it. Typically I'll just go to Detail, and the sharpening that I do here is similar to deconvolution sharpening, and the way you do that is you move your radius slider all the way to the left, the detail slider all the way to the right, and then this masking lets you mask based on luminosity. And I don't want to sharpen the dark areas because that's usually where noise lives. So I'll usually move my masking slider over near the center, and usually a little bit of noise reduction. It looks like this can tolerate quite a bit of the texture. We may want to bring the overall exposure up just a little bit, and that brings out a little bit more of that IFN. And again, as I said, you have to decide how much you want IFN to be dominant in the picture and how much you want to focus on just the galaxy. And then the last thing I'll do is crop, and I think I'll do a square crop on this. And maybe something like that, where it looks like it's kind of exploding into center. And I'm going to say that's pretty close to a finished image. May need to tweak the crop just a little bit. It looks a little bit unbalanced. That looks better. Yeah, I don't know how much I like that IFN in the background, and there's some artifacts that I didn't get cleaned up. For instance, right here you can see an artifact that's probably on the luminance layer. Since we've been at this well over an hour, we might as well talk about how this is non-destructive. So we have this loaded in Lightroom. Let me jump back over to Photoshop. I still have it open, but I'm going to go ahead and close it. So from Lightroom, we've got our document here. I can open this for editing, and the easy way is just Control-E. That would be Command-E on a Mac. And you've got three choices, and the one you almost always want is Edit Original. So click Edit, and what it's going to do is just reopen this PSB file in Photoshop. And remember, it's this dark moat right here that we're wanting to adjust. And if you recall, that was very early on in the editing process, and in fact one of the first things we did. And right here is what we're trying to get to. So let's go to our luminance layer, and let's say we want to address this with our healing brush. So I'll double click on the luminance layer smart object. So this was our original layer that we cleaned up with the healing brush. There's our mote right there. So I'm going to grab the healing brush, choose the source area, paint over it. So now that area is fixed. If you recall, this area we fixed by burning and dodging. And maybe there's another one there. So maybe there's another one here. Sometimes as you work through, you start finding more problem areas as you continue stretching and building up the image. So we'll just clean up what looks like maybe a few more of those dust mote problems. So now that I'm done updating the edit on this layer, I'll simply close this. It'll say, do I want to save it? And I'll say yes. And what it's going to do is save this back into the smart object in the PSB file that we can then close. And when we look at it in Lightroom, it's going to have all of these updates carried through. Sometimes it takes a while because it needs to update the smart object, but you can see that area has been fixed here. So now I'll close this in Photoshop, and it'll ask, do I want to save it? Yes. So it's going to resave the PSB master file. And when we go back to Lightroom, it will update the view there, and there it went. So now that's been fixed. That is why you do non-destructive editing. That as you work your way through iteratively, at least the way I work, I almost always find something that I want to change or that I missed or that I can improve. And so I'll go back and work on it a second time or a third time or a fifth time, however many times it takes. So wondering if there's more detail to be brought out here. I think what I'll do is put quite a dark circle around that star that we need to address. So I'm going to start by painting with do a selective adjustment here with a brush, and I'm just going to brush over the bright area of the nebula to create an adjustment. And let's see if I lower the highlights, does that brings out a little bit more of that detail. I might even take the blacks down and really bring out some of that detail in the core, and maybe increase the saturation. Yeah, I like that. So I'll close that. And we need to come back and fix this dark area. And that dark area is probably from cleaning up a smudge on the luminosity layer where that star was removed. So let's go back to Photoshop, Control E, Edit Original. And this one will adjust. We've got a burn and dodge layer already available on that luminosity group. So we'll use that to address it. It's a little hard to see, but it's around this star right here. So let's just go to our burn and dodge layer in the luminance group, and I'm just going to grab the brush tool and paint with white and restore a little bit of that glow around it. That might be a bit too much. Not sure if that's enough. We'll see. So close this. Again, save it. Now we go back to Lightroom to see the result. And as soon as it finishes saving, it will update the view in Lightroom, and we'll see that dark circle hopefully just disappear. Yep, that looks better. Looks more natural. So I'm going to call that finished at this point, at least in terms of the video. The last thing I would do is export this as a JPEG. And to do that, In the library module, I have to move there's an export button right here. Click export, and you can have a whole host of saved presets for different kinds of output that you might want to create. And the one I'm going to choose, you scroll down through my presets, is my Udro JPEG. So that is a preset that has a saved file destination and all of the different settings for how I want it sized for 1920 on the pixels on the long side, whatever details you want to apply. Those are set in that export preset. Lightroom's moving slow this morning. I know how it feels. There, it's caught up. So it's going to save it as a JPEG, 1920 pixels on the long side. It adds my Utah Desert Remote Observatory's logo in the lower right. So when I click export, it will export that image. And if I open up the File Explorer, I'm working on the File Explorer on my other monitor. Sorry, you can't. So there is the JPEG that was just created through this process. So, whoops, I'm back. And I'm back because I noticed a couple things that I wanted to change, and this video is already too long, so I figure I might as well make it just a little bit longer. Two things if you look at this closely. One, I'm not particularly happy with especially the brighter stars. I'd like them to have a little bit more zing and sparkle. And secondly, if you notice some of these dark red stars, when you boost the saturation, that works great on the bright stars, but you wind up with these little red dots that look like noise. So let's address those two issues. So I'm going to reopen this in Photoshop just like we did before. Control E will bring up the editing dialog, and we'll choose to edit the original. And remember, we have this saved as a .psb large Photoshop document, so it has all the layers intact. Everything we've done is still undoable. So let's do two things. First, I want to, you see these red stars? That's real easy to fix. We'll just go to our stars layer, go to the hue saturation, and remember this is the hue and saturation of just the stars, and this is primarily affecting red stars. So let's just target the red colors and drop the saturation down, and sometimes you take it all the way down, sometimes I'll leave a little bit of color in them, but that gets rid of that dark red that just looks like noise. So that solves one of the problems. The other problem is I need some of the stars to be a little bit brighter, and I've probably darkened them more than I wanted to or could have when we processed them in PixInsight. So what I've already done is I went back to PixInsight and reprocessed the RGB data so that the stars were brighter. Didn't diminish them quite as much. Everything else was the same. Did the star extraction and saved those. So let's open that, and I'm just going to open that as a new document. And we'll have to navigate, well, you know, we're already there. So here's the bright stars. So let's open that. So we're opening this as a second document, so we'll have two tabs here at the top of Photoshop. And that doesn't look too bad. Let's unlock the background, convert it to a smart object just because we know we're going to do this. we'll run our sharpening, Smart Sharpen, and I'm really kind of focused here on the bigger, brighter stars, and I want to get a little bit more pop into those stars. Don't want to go too far, but want them to look nice. And we'll say that's okay. And as soon as this is finished, we'll do a couple other things before we finish up. We'll boost the saturation of these stars. So we'll add a hue saturation, and we'll pull the saturation up so that the stars look good. And we're going to have the same issue with red stars, so I might as well just go ahead and grab the reds and take that saturation down so that we don't create a bunch of new bright red stars. And then lastly, I'll just select both layers and Control G, drop that into a group, and we'll call this bright stars. So now we want to add this on top of everything else that we've already done with this image. And just to keep things simple, I'm going to collapse some of these layers so that they're not taking up so much room. And especially I want to collapse the stars layer because I want this new layer to go on top of this one. So I have the top layer selected, or that top layer group, and that's the stars. I'll come back to the new document. I'm going to tap V for the move tool, and then click and drag, and keep holding the mouse button down as I drag this over to our original document. Still holding the mouse button down, drag into the document, press and hold the Shift key to tell Photoshop we want to center the document or place it in kind of the same place it came from, and then I can release everything. And this will take a few seconds, but what it's going to do is copy and paste that whole layer group from the document that I had opened and place that layer group on top of the layer that had been selected, which was our stars layer. So this is going to wind up at the very top of the layer stack in the new document. And again, these are all reasons why I love non-destructive editing. I tend to work very iteratively. I will finish a process, look at it, find something I missed, find something I want to do differently, do better, and just reopen it and go back to right where I left off. So I can go back, virtually to the beginning. At any point, if I need to go back and update some of the editing on dust motes, that's all still available. So now our bright stars layer is here on top, and let's just turn it off momentarily. And I'm going to do two things here. The first set of stars looks good, but I'm going to minimize these a little bit, and I'm going to do that by selecting our original stars layer group, and instead of screen mode, I'm going to use lighten blending mode. And lighten blending mode is not as aggressive as screen, so it makes the stars a little bit smaller. And if we want to compare those, this is screen, this is lighten. Not a big difference, but a little difference. Now I'm going to go to our bright stars layer that we just brought over. I'll turn that on, and this I will put in screen blending mode. And so if we look at the combination where we have all of the stars, they're nice, big, bright. If I turn this layer off, that was before, that's after. So it really boosts the stars, gives them a little bit more sparkle. I may tone them down just slightly with a levels adjustment. And the way the levels adjustment, there's two sets of sliders. This top set affects the, brightens things. So for instance, if I grab this left slider, the right slider, and slide it to the left, I'm brightening the highlights. And there's no way to dim the highlights by going further. If you want to dim the highlights, what you do is you grab this lower slider, and if I pull it to the left, it's dimming the whites. And sometimes it's good to pull those back a little bit so that you don't have anything at pure white. And if I think the stars are too obtrusive over the galaxy, and let's turn this on and off and see. Might be just a little bit, so I'm going to add a layer mask to that new group that I just brought in that's in screen blending mode. And I can grab my brush tool and paint with black over the center here and diminish those stars so that it has more focus on just the galaxy. But I might want to bring back some of the stars selectively. So I'm going to go to a smaller brush, switch to white, and restore some of those stars that I just went out of my way to make brighter. So we'll have a few nice bright stars surrounding the galaxy. We've diminished most of the rest of them so they don't compete with the galaxy, but then surrounding it we have nice bright stars. And we can turn that layer mask on and off to preview just by shift clicking on the layer mask, and that's the difference that makes. If we want somewhere between fully off and fully on, we can come up to the properties panel up here, and we can use the density slider to adjust the density of that mask if we want to maybe apply it halfway. So I think that looks better, gives the stars a little bit more sparkle, and we want sparkly stars, just not shimmering stars, because that's bad seeing. So I hope that helps, and I will stop here and go back to the original video. So I'll stop here. I hope you found this useful. If you did, be sure to like and subscribe. If you have any questions, ask those in the comments. And I hope you found this helpful. And as always, I hope you have a great day today and an even better night tonight under a clear, dark sky. Thanks.